This morning, I'm going to run a little long, and I apologize for that. Worse, I'm going to do a little bit of insider baseball. So this is going to be basically me committing multiple preacher fouls in one morning. So I'm going to do my best to keep you all along for the ride, but in the spirit of transparency, I am grumpy. In case you were unclear, I am not a fan of winter. So if you, Dave Zacher, have been gleefully looking forward to snow, or if you've been out there sharpening your cross-country skis or planning some winter wonderland escape, good for you. Feel free, you can feel free to keep all that to yourself. But here on the cusp of February, I am compelled to remember that not even Roman emperors liked February. That's why they stole days for another month. They were clearly trying to make it as short as humanly possible. This week is Groundhog Day, and looking outside, I'm pretty sure we can all guess what Punxsutawney Phil is going to see. Cold, folks. He's going to see cold. Now, we've talked about Groundhog Day in recent years. My calendar also tells me that February 2nd is St. Bridget's Day and Candlemas. And I think it's interesting that this part of the year inspired so many different holidays. We're going to do what we can to get by. One of these holidays is Imbolc. Our neo-pagan friends know this one. It's part of the wheel of the year, and it sits midway between winter solstice and spring equinox. It's a pivot, if you will. Officially, Imbolc is a spring festival, and as you can see outside, that totally makes sense. I'm just guessing that the seasons were a tad bit different in pre-Roman Ireland, but even if that's true, I suppose it makes sense that right now, even though there's fresh snow on the ground and at least a month of cold in front of us, there are gardeners out there ordering seeds. Anybody doing this right now? Yeah, weirdos. That's fine. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. I used to do this too. Anyway, cleaning tools, y'all making preparations, doing plotting and planning for spring. It's good stuff. Because change is coming. Whether we like it or not, change is coming. And we can feel this, you and I, even if we're not gardeners or weather forecasting rodents. Our national politics have lifted the scent of change for some time now. You and I, we've lived through the Obama years and the Tea Party revolution. We saw change with Trump and from his goofy escalator ride right up to his failed insurrection. We're seeing it now with a disordered Supreme Court and the ending of Roe v. Wade, and then the erasure of Black history from high schools all over the country. Governors across our great nation are choosing not to take up the work of their people, choosing not to improve the lives and lots of their people, and instead choosing to take on the looming threat of woke culture and critical race theory. Change is inevitable, but why does it have to be so blazingly dumb? Sometimes. A few decades ago, science fiction writer Octavia Butler wrote a dystopian novel, The Parable of the Sower. Anybody ever read this book? I recommend it. It's a good pickup. I've talked about it before, but for me, one of the coolest parts of this book is her idea of change, how she conceives of change. Change is inevitable, she wrote. So we, as human beings, have a choice. We can either shape the change that is coming or be victims of it. Powerful lesson, shape the change. I like to think that this is the basic idea that farmers have looking at the year ahead. What gardeners are thinking right now, maybe even what plants are thinking as they poke out of the ground. And maybe that's what we should be thinking about, looking at who we want to be in the world that we find ourselves in. And that brings me to Article 2. This is my second time visiting this topic. The first was just before the election, and I'm pretty sure that if I do it again, it will seal the deal on me as a grumpy old man shouting at kids to get off my lawn. But the challenge that any winter gardener exploring fundamental and inevitable change is this: do you cling to your mistakes, especially if you've invested a lot of time and effort making them? How much do you intervene? How much do you let go? This next part is insider baseball again, so I'll try to be clear and I'll try to be brief, but know that there's just way too much to cover here, or any Sunday morning. Consider this an invitation to explore on your own, and know that I am available to talk, to explore, and to quiz later, but here goes. So if you have been following along, you probably have, Article 2 of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations is the part that includes our 7 principles and 6 sources. This is our collection of who we are and where we came from statements. These sorts of statements are things that most religious traditions make. For example, depending on who you are or where you came from, you may have heard or even said something like this on any given Sunday morning, quote, "I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father, through him all things were made." Anybody do this in their misbegotten youth? Yeah, right. That is just the first part of the Nicene Creed. That, or one of the other creeds, these are standard practice even amongst many other Christian churches. They are and are meant to be definitional, right? And if you've been playing along, you will know that in one of life's curious twists, Unitarian Universalism does not have a statement like this. We have no testimony of faith. We don't do creeds. And because of this, many mainline churches, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Catholics, that is why they don't even consider us a church at all. We have no creed. And our primary focus is not proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. Strikes 1 and strikes 2. And for the record, we do not do either of these things because when we look for the ties to bind us together, a common chant and a common read are clearly not sufficient to make people do the right thing. No, here we want more than that. And so instead, we reach for something a bit older. We reach for covenant. You may remember from your bat mitzvah classes that covenant is a relationship, an agreement, one that exists between people on the one hand, and on the other, that mystery that transcends all understanding. Covenant is more than a series of I believe statements. They're a series of I promise to do statements. And that's a huge difference, a special difference. It is so special that, once upon a time, one covenant got hammered into stone tablets, put into a very special box, and was paraded out in front of victorious Hebrew armies. Later, it was lost in the desert, found 3,000 years later by a scholar named Indiana Jones, promptly melted a bunch of people, and finally the US government took it and locked it away in a secret warehouse. But that is why UUs are all for fedoras, bullwhips, and advanced degrees in archaeology. Sorry, that was last night's watching. It was fun. We are a covenantal people. We make promises to each other about who we are and how we treat each other. These promises are our principles. Let's take a moment and review. We covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth of dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and finally, respect for the independent web of all existence of which we are a part. These are poetic. And I believe them to be clear, to spell out a very specific theology, actually, one that talks about who we are, how we behave personally and communally, and what we are here on earth to do. They are not perfect. In fact, they're not the principles that our denomination even started out with. We have, in fact, revised Article 2 in whole or part more than once. And that is kind of weird. Remember, the Nicene Creed was last revised back in 325 of the Common Era. Our current principles only date back to 1985. This fact is a story, one that we tell about who we are. The story is about our faith being a, quote, living tradition, one that is expected to transform over time. I like to think of Maya Angelou, who once said, quote, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better." And that is the spirit that I think we try to live up to. We keep trying to do better. And it's pretty obvious that today things are just not what they were 35, 38 years ago. We've seen more than one pandemic. We've seen wars in the Middle East and refugees everywhere. We've seen the end of the Cold War and what looks increasingly like the beginning of a not-so-Cold War. We've seen Me Too and Black Lives Matter and MAGA and the Tea Party. We've seen the towers fall. We've seen actual Nazis on our streets, fascists in our capital, and the rise of global authoritarianism. It's been a lot. It's really not surprising to expect that our principles could use a revisit. Now, written into our definitional statements of our identity is this expectation, an expectation that the revelation that is our faith is not sealed. Every 15 years or so, we are actually called to take a look, to see if things need tweaking, changing, revision, and to take up that work if it's necessary. Perhaps it is a testament to those who wrote our current principle statements that they have survived so long untouched. But recent events have convinced many that the time has come. About 6 or so years ago, some hiring practices at the UUA were called into question. Tempers flared, accusations were made. The president of the UUA unexpectedly quit. It was a really tense period. A lot of good people said a lot of incredibly insensitive things. Even more, said some impenetrably obtuse things. Good times. But into that gap, the General Assembly voted to revisit our principles. And there is a certain irony to this. Some had felt that our words were not adequate to capture a newfound cultural enthusiasm for anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism. And this was not just the UUA. These same issues simultaneously seized a great many liberal-leaning progressive and activist organizations all around our country. And now, with this new crisis at the UUA leading to accusations of persistent and pervasive white supremacy culture, some suggested that what we really needed was not reinterpretation, not new programs, not more resources. What we needed was more words. Which brings me to the new draft, all new with 50% more words. I apologize. While accurate, that is not entirely fair. And our current exploration is not the first time since 1985 that folks have questioned our principles. 20-some years ago, then UUA president, the Reverend Dr. William Sinkford, launched a startling and unexpected critique, suggesting that what our principles and sources really and truly lacked was not words of activism and accountability, but even the whisper of reverence. To paraphrase, he suggested that our principles contained little mystery, even less call to wonder and awe, and no hint of the holy. Singford has a point. I want to say that the holy is in there, but it's something you have to unpack. And that is probably why many don't bother, or if they do bother, they fumble it. Our principles have a distressing tendency to be read as something benignly unobjectionable, blandly liberal, generically progressive, and they could cheerfully and thoughtlessly be adopted by just about any Western social club. That is, our principles really don't cross the line into belief statements that Martin Luther would have been tempted to attack 99 times. And that brings me to the new words. Many of you may have already seen the new draft proposal. I say draft, because that makes it sound like there's an opportunity for major revisions, but there isn't. There have already been many feedback sessions over the last few months, and the avalanche of comments and suggestions have already been submitted. While it will make my clergy colleagues upset to hear me say it, the truth is self-evident. Whatever suggestions were offered, they were also largely dismissed or ignored. Now, for those of you trying to keep track, the primary difference between the old Article 2 and the new Article 2 is a move from 7 principle statements to 6 shared values. So no more principles, instead values. These values are interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. And all 6 of them can be seen as pivoting around an axis of love. Can we get a graphic? That's what they're proposing. As values go, these are actually pretty good. And in the spirit of curiosity, I suppose we're going to have to wait and see if they're sturdy enough to carry our religious tradition for another 15 years. But at the risk of being called that grumpy old man, I have questions. Where did democracy go? What about reason, the search for truth and meaning, inherent worth and dignity? Well, they're all in there, somewhere underneath individual values. But that said, they're also jumbled, broken, words scrambled. The new proposal reads as if someone took scissors to the old document and just rearranged all the words to create some kind of ransom note. It's a mess. That said, it is painfully obvious what the new draft is aiming at. And clearly the authors are trying to call our faith tradition into a more aggressive, more explicitly activist stance. Back in 1963, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in the letter from Birmingham jail, which we cited a few weeks ago, accused white moderates, you and me, of choosing comfort over confrontation. And this draft could be seen as an answer to Dr. King. I applaud the sentiment, I really do. I also challenge it. I said this before, so this will hardly come as a surprise. Unitarian Universalism is a faith tradition. It's not the 4-H. We're not the Moose Club or the veterans of foreign wars. Despite our calling ourselves a society, we are not the Illuminati. I'm sorry if that's a surprise. But we're also not Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, the League of Women Voters, or the Sierra Club. Despite our support for these fine and incredibly important groups, despite our urging and chanting and marching, despite our commitment to showing up, and our 250-year history of doing just that, we are not an activist organization. It's tempting to say that, but the truth is it's flatly false. We are more than that, and this draft makes us less than that. And that's sad. The short of it is this: every one of these 6 values, as currently written, manages to both misinterpret and devalue something from our history, our theology, and our aspirations. And while I am a firm believer in the proverb that says the perfect is the enemy of the good, to apply it, you have to assume at least that you are starting from good. I've been talking for quite some time now. I'm checking my watch. The nearly overwhelming temptation for me is to start pulling these new statements apart, value by value, word salad by word salad. So I, in an increasingly desperate attempt to be brief, let me say that I have deep concerns about decentering democracy in a time of global authoritarianism, decentering the search for truth and meaning while we are recovering from a global pandemic and massive isolation, decentering inherent worth when more and more frustrated seekers are asking if churches are all the same. I have deep concerns because somewhere back at the beginning of all of this was the very interesting, very persuasive Eighth Principle Project, which apparently has been lost in the blender. But in the interest of time, I'll lift up one specific: love. This is what the new draft says about love. Quote, "The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. And we draw from our heritage of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. And finally, love is the power that holds us together and is the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." Look, I'm a preacher. I am all about the transformative power of love. I'm not sure what the spiritual discipline of love is, or if the authors are aware that they're simultaneously appropriating and colonizing Catholicism with their invitation to, quote, liberating love. But I will gladly acknowledge that love is the hub around which the wheel of a happy and whole human life might spin. Love is important. Love is also complicated, especially in English. Generous love, tough love, love of God, love of neighbor, love of family, love of friend, lusty love, unrequited love, obsessive love, motherly love, self-love, selfless love, love of progress, love of prosperity. Love is what you need. Love is a foundational religious concern, and attempting to zoom in on whatever it is that sits behind this important usage of the word is a fun game. But it doesn't change the fact that love is a decidedly generic marker of an indeterminate and indecisive faith. And today we have to ask if love is really only interesting in its absence. And that is probably why it is exceptionally difficult to name a single serious faith tradition today that does not claim to be solidly rooted in it. Is that really all we've got? As I finally turn to the close, I'm reminded of Dr. Sinkford's now largely ignored critique. This was the bit about our principles contain no hint of the holy. Again, I'll disagree with him on this. The hints are there. But if I'm being fully transparent, I have to agree with his larger point. Bare hints are only barely enough. We can reject litmus tests and altar calls and professions of faith and anything that even smells like the Nicene or the Apostles' Creed. But I like to believe we do believe something. If we are going to talk about love, we could talk about love beyond belief or loving the hell out of the world, couldn't we? And don't we agree that life can have purpose? That we humans can be glorious and terrible beyond measure? That community fulfills and isolation kills, that human life is precious, that the considered life is an enriched life, that the engaged life can be our highest calling, that we have an obligation to better ourselves and our world, that we cannot know the future. While we cannot know the future, The arc of human agency and human history calls us onward, upward, forever. That salvation is the reward of human action, not human belief. That we are more than the sum of our past, more than the sum of our parts, more than the sum of our actions. That our destiny lies among the stars. There is a lot we can say and still not hang a cross around every neck. Given the opportunity to revisit and revise the definitional statements of what it means to be a UU in the 21st century, we could choose to say big things, hard things, things that put inspiration between perspiration and aspiration. We could do that. We could have done that. We did not do that. Instead, we chose to defer a grand statement of identity to some future committee, to some future poet, to some future vote. We are a living tradition, after all, so maybe next time. So, point of order for you all. The draft has been 2 years in the making. They only revealed their proposal a few months ago, so it's not like we're late to the party. If you're curious about the new draft, we've posted it on our Facebook page, and you can find it online by searching for UUA Article 2. It's not terrible. It's just... Next steps. As I understand it, this spring there will be an opportunity for the UUA board to make changes to the proposed draft. Now, my hope is that our leadership will seize this opportunity for a rather dramatic set of changes, but that is because I am an unquenchably optimistic person. The reality is that changes will likely be far less sweeping than we hope for. The word democracy, for example, was completely absent in the first draft. After a nearly universal outcry, the committee inserted this noble ideal as a suggested best practice, and that's where we're at. Anyway, after this round of edits come the amendments. This process here is complicated on purpose. At this year's General Assembly, amendments will be considered and either accepted or rejected. Then the draft is going to get voted on. A simple majority of vote will advance the proposal to the next General Assembly, where we'll need a 2/3 majority vote to be adopted. So if you have concerns or thoughts right now, this is a good time to be involved. Just to set expectations, some version of this draft will likely pass. There will be a lot of noise, a lot of outrage. Some of it might even be reasonable. There will be a lot of clergy hostile to the changes. Even more clergy will be hostile to the hostility. Pointed and polemical things will be said in every direction. That's not weird, that's just how UUs do things. But with all of that ahead of us, one thing appears clear on this cold February doorstep: change is coming. And so it is that we return to Octavia Butler, who asks this of me, of us, of you. Will you step up? Will you change? Will you shape the change that is coming? Or will you be victims of it? The choice is always yours. May the Spirit that surpasses all understanding fill us, shield us, and lift us as together we strive onward, upward, forever. So say we all. Amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.